Hi. Um, so we're about to start the third chapter, December the 3rd. And so far, we have um, in those little notes, we have Elizabeth, the sheep, and the angel. And they're going to Bethlehem to witness Jesus' birth, basically. So I'm just gonna power on and you guys enjoy. The Christmas Mystery by Jostein Gaarder, December the 3rd. Joachim woke up early on December the 3rd. The Donald Duck clock hanging above his desk said 7:15. Mum and Papa would not be up for another half hour. He remembered that he'd dreamed about something strange, but he wasn't quite sure what. He had had something to do with the angel Ethereal and the lamb. He sat up in bed and looked closely at the magic advent calendar. At the top of the picture, several angels were floating down through the clouds in the sky. One of them was blowing a trumpet. That was to wake up all the sheep and the shepherds, of course. Joachim imagined that the angel on the right of the picture must be the angel Ethereal. He looked just like Joachim thought Ethereal looked. Suddenly he noticed that angel was smiling at him, lifting an arm as if trying to wave at Joachim. The angel in the picture looked clear. The angel in the picture looked clearer than yesterday. Joachim got up on the bed and opened the door with number 3 on it. He saw a tiny picture of a vintage car. He had seen that kind of old car at the Technical Museum with Grandpa. Joachim didn't understand what a vintage car could have to do with Christmas, but he picked up the thin sheet of paper that had fallen out of the calendar. He snuggled down under the covers and began to read. Elizabeth and the angel Ethereal went on running after the little lamb. Soon they left the woods behind and were going down a narrow country lane. In the distance, thick smoke rose from some tall factory chimneys. "There's a town," said Elizabeth. "That's Halden," explained the angel. "We're fairly close to Sweden." Suddenly they heard a clatter right behind them. Elizabeth turned and saw an old car heading towards them. In the car sat a man wearing a hat and a coat. He had a black beard and looked a little like the picture of her great-grandfather on the mantelpiece at home. As the car passed them, the man honked the horn and saluted with his hat. "Look at that car!" exclaimed Elizabeth. "It must be very old." "On the contrary, I think it was probably brand new," said Ethereal. Elizabeth sighed. "I always thought angels were much cleverer than humans, but you don't seem to know much about cars." Still, she didn't want to quarrel with the angel, so she went on. "But I suppose you don't drive cars in heaven. I imagine God has forbidden any kind of pollution." Ethereal pointed to a large pile of logs. "Sit down here," he said. "You deserve a short rest. And there's something important I have to tell you about our journey to Bethlehem." Elizabeth sat down and looked up at the angel. "Don't you get tired too?" she asked. The angel shook his head. "No, angels don't get tired, because we're not made of flesh and blood. When you get tired, it's your flesh and blood that feel it most." Elizabeth felt a little embarrassed that she had thought angels could get tired. If they had been able to, they surely wouldn't have the strength to fly up and down between heaven and earth. That must be very far, maybe even farther than Bethlehem. "Exactly where are we going, my dear?" asked the angel. "To Bethlehem," replied Elizabeth. "Very well. And what are we going to do there?" "We're going to pet the lamb." The angel nodded. "And we welcome the baby Jesus into the world. He was called God's Lamb. That was because he was just as kind as an innocent as a little lamb's fleece is soft. Elizabeth shrugged. This was something she'd never thought about. But it's not enough just to travel to Bethlehem, the angel continued. We have to travel 2,000 years back in time too. That's because when you started to run after the lamb, just about that length of time had passed since Jesus was born. We'll try to get there at the moment when the great wonder happens. Isn't it absolutely impossible to travel back in time? Elizabeth asked. Ethereal shook his head. Not absolutely, no. Nothing is impossible for God, and I'm here as God's messenger, so practically nothing is impossible for me either. We have a small part of the long way behind us already. Down there you see Halden, and we're at the beginning of the 20th century after Jesus' birth. Can you understand that? Elizabeth's eyes widened, and she nodded. I think so. And that means the vintage car wasn't so old after all. No, it must have been brand new. I'm sure you noticed how proud the driver was when he honked his horn. Not very many people owned cars at this time. Elizabeth simply sat and stared, and the angel Ethereal continued. I would have taken a very long time to run to Bethlehem in a straight line, but we're also running diagonally down throughout history. So, in a way, we're going downhill all the time. It's like running before the wind, or like rushing down an escalator. Elizabeth nodded. She was not at all sure she understood everything the angel said, but she understood enough to realize how clever it was. How do you know we're at the beginning of the 20th century? The angel raised his arm and pointed at a gold watch on his wrist. It was decorated with a row of spinning pearls. On its face it said 1916. It's an angel watch, he exclaimed. It isn't quite as accurate as other watches, but in heaven we're not too particular about all those hours and minutes. Why not? We have the whole of eternity to see, replied the angel. Besides, we never have to catch a bus or get to work on time. Now Elizabeth understood why the church clock had only struck 3, even though it had been 6 or 7 o'clock when she ran from the shop, and why the snow had disappeared, and it had suddenly become summer. She had run backward in time. You began running along the diagonal path as soon as you started chasing the lamb, continued the angel Ethereal. That's when the long journey through time and space began. Another car approached them from the opposite direction. It left such a cloud of dust and sand behind it that it made Elizabeth cough. When the dust cloud had settled, she pointed up the road. There's our lamb again, but now there's a grown sheep as well. The angel nodded. Verily I say unto you, the sheep is going to Bethlehem too. With that they began to run. When Elizabeth and Ethereal had caught up with the lamb and the sheep, both of them bounded on as well. Little lamb, coaxed Elizabeth. But the lamb and the sheep would not be coaxed until standing still. They were going to Bethlehem. To Bethlehem! They passed the outskirts of Halden. They paused for a moment and looked down at all the people walking in the streets and the market. The ladies were wearing long, colourful cotton dresses and large hats. Several vintage cars were sputtering along the streets, but there were horses and carriages as well. They left it behind them and soon came to a border station. A large sign announced, Border, Sweden. Elizabeth stopped abruptly. Do you think we'll be allowed to go into Sweden? They won't dare stop a pilgrimage, he replied. Besides, it's only a few weeks since Norway had the same king as Sweden. May I look at your angel watch again? Ethereal stretched out his arm. The watch said 1905. Then they sped past two border guards, the lamb and the sheep first, and Elizabeth Hansen and the Angel Ethereal just behind them. "Halt!" shouted the border guards. "In the name of the law!" But they were already far into Sweden, and they had come a few years closer to the birth of Jesus. Joachim sat up in bed. So that was why there was a picture of a vintage car in the advent calendar. That was why it had suddenly become summer. Joachim quickly locked the piece of paper with the story of Elizabeth and the Angel Ethereal in the secret box. Afterwards, he sat for a long time, thinking over what he had read. Elizabeth hadn't just set off after the lamb and followed it into the woods. She had begun to run back in time as well. She had already come to the year 1905, but she was going all the way to Bethlehem when Jesus was born. Joachim knew that it happened almost 2,000 years ago. He was old enough to know that you can't really run back in time, but it was possible to do it in your thoughts. At school, he had heard that 1,000 years to mankind can be as one single day to God. And the Angel Ethereal had told Elizabeth that nothing is impossible for God. Could Elizabeth and the angel really have run back in time? He heard Mama on the landing. She came into his room and asked, "Have you opened the advent calendar?" He nodded, and Mama looked at the picture in the calendar. "A vintage car!" she exclaimed. She sounded surprised, almost disappointed. Perhaps she thought there should be pictures of angels and Christmassy things every day. "It's because Elizabeth and the Angel Ethereal have to run to Sweden at the time when vintage cars like that were brand new," said Joachim. "They're going to run all the way to Bethlehem." "You're really a storyteller," said Mama, patting him on the head. Then she went into the bathroom. Joachim felt a tickle in his stomach when he thought about all the clever things he knew about which Mama and Papa believed he was just making up. He decided on something even cleverer. On Christmas Eve, he'd put together all the pieces of paper that had come from the magic calendar and placed the package under the Christmas tree. Then he would write "To the best Mama and Papa in the world" on the outside. The idea made him look forward to Christmas even more, but it wasn't always good to look forward to something. It could be boring too, if it took a long time to come. When he looked forward to something terribly exciting, it could almost give him a headache. That afternoon, Papa complained that he still hadn't found his driver license. In that case, he wasn't really supposed to drive, said Mama. But when Papa heard that, he snorted like a steam engine. That was that of December. And yeah, just tune in for tomorrow for some more. Love you all. Bye.